The following is my contribution to the virtual Joy of 6 2021, the Battle of Lund 1676. I will provide a short overview of the situation, some considerations we have done with the rules, presenting the armies, a quick summary of us playing the battle and how the table was made, and of course a lot of footage of it. We hope to convey some of the Joy of 6 and this particular period of Scandinavian history, the Scanian War. I wonder how many of the visitors enjoying themselves here at Rå, on the west coast of Sweden, with Denmark somewhere on the horizon, reflect on the fact that in June 1675 a Danish army, 15,000 strong, came over the sea to regain Scania. It must have been an impressive sight, seeing all those sails getting closer and closer. Scania was one of the land areas that had been lost to Sweden following the peace treaty in Roskilde 1658. This was a significant loss to the Danes, and they had been waiting for an opportunity that now had presented itself, as Sweden had been dragged into a war as a consequence of their alliance with France, the so-called Franco-Dutch War. Denmark had opted to support the Dutch side, and while Sweden was focusing its military efforts in Brandenburg, one of the many German states, Scania was very soon under Danish control, and this was broadly welcomed by the people living in Scania. The Swedish forces in the area had to withdraw further north. Following Swedish mobilization, a field battle was fought outside Halmstad in the province of Halland on the 17th of August 1675. The Danes decided to withdraw back to Scania and were followed by the Swedish army. In October the same year, the Swedish King Charles XI marched into Scania with an army of 12,000, forcing the Danes on the defensive. A month later, the armies had sought winter camp outside the city of Lund. The Swedish army was running low on supplies, and although they had only 8,000 men, due to losses in the field, compared to the 13,000 for the Danish, they decided to seek battle on the 4th of December 1676. The initial idea was a surprise attack on the Danish camp, but during the march to the camp, the scouts warned that the area was not suitable for advancing with the horses or to fight a battle, and the Swedish king instead sought to get a position with height advantage north of the city of Lund. The Danes realized what was going on and started to race towards Lund. This is where we will start our war game, with the two armies set up north of Lund between Lund and the village of Valkärra, with the infantry elements in two lines in the center and with two wings of cavalry, the right and the left. All elements have a second line, but due to the lack of infantry, the Swedish second infantry line contains mainly mounted units. The Swedish army is commanded by Simon Grundel Helmfelt and King Charles XI, with Fashion on the right, Schultz in the center and Galle on the left. The Danish army is commanded by Karl von Arenstorff and King Christian V, with Merheim on the right, Schack in the center and Sandberg on the left. Let the battle commence. We will be using the Twilight of the Sun King rules, produced by the Pike and Shot Society. They are a fast play rule set that I've used to play some of the many great Northern War battles I and the rules writer Nick Dorrell have been doing over the last few years. But there are a few modifications that's been necessary due to some specifics of this battle. 1. The differing tactics of the sides, and 2. The size of the infantry battalions and cavalry squadrons. In addition, the battle was played with a unit being the equivalent of one battalion as opposed to two battalions and two squadrons forming a unit. The Swedish army was smaller in terms of overall size, but also in relative size, so a lot of the units have been given the small status to reflect the relative size differences between the squadrons and battalions. main challenge was in the differing fighting techniques of the armies. The Danish side was using the old Dutch technique that was based on defensive musket firing by ranks, whilst the Swedish side had recently instructed a more aggressive approach, like that deployed by the Swedes but now forgotten in the 30 Years' War, and more like what was about to come in the Great Northern War, the gå på. The Swedish instruction was to start firing by rank at 80 paces in 3 ranks, then advance to 10 paces, seeing the enemy's whites, then fire all ranks at once, followed by going in with rapier in hand and musket in the reverse. Given this, the Danish infantry was modelled at pike infantry, whilst the Swedish as gå på infantry in the rules. The Danish battalions being superior in firing, but the Swedish in melee. The infantry units had a proportion of pikemen. The infantryman was equipped with a musket and a rapier. No bayonets were yet used by the Danish or Swedish armies. The 3 battalions of mainly Dutch sailors who participated in the battle were modelled as raw and inferior in musketry. For the mounted units, the Danes were still deploying the caracol. This was based on the cavalry moving relatively slowly towards the enemy, fire at its pistols per rank and ride back, reload and repeat. The mounted units in the era normally carried 2 pistols and a rapier. The caracol has been classified as poor cavalry tactics, whilst the soldiers still retained their trained and in some cases elite rating. This to symbolize good soldiers deploying an inferior tactic. The Swedes again had differing instruction. The cavalryman was not allowed to discharge his pistol until he saw the whites of his enemy and then charge in. The second pistol was saved for firing at the reserve, following a successful breakthrough, the objective being to penetrate and scatter the enemy. For the Swedes we allowed all mounted units galloping horse status that had been recently reintroduced, but gave them a quality grade 1 level below the expected. In essence, the elite regiments were classified as trained, whilst the other line as raw, with the exception of the lifeguards and the drabants. For the few dragon regiments, we have also classified these as galloping horse for the Swedes, but as poor cavalry dragoons for the Danes. The Danes also had significantly more artillery, and we have given them 6 bases of artillery versus the Swedish 2. The artillery were deployed in between the battalion in the first line of the infantry center. The ratings for the commanders, 1 for each wing and the center, has been given as average, with the overall command bases with the monarch and the commander-in-chief a good status. We have made no difference between the differing sides in terms of command quality at this stage. Although the real battle was fought in a more confusing and more moving feast, the battle we will be playing on the table today is a classical linear battle. And we will fought it on the mat. We have tried to build in some of the elevation, some of the frozen creeks, the roads, the villages, the bridges, the forests and the windmill on the windmill hill close to Lund. Here are a few pictures from a battle we played. We have played the battle twice and both were enjoyable. We have had a Danish and a Swedish victory so far. The 2 right wings normally do their job, being traditionally stronger than the left. And then it's a matter of what happens in the center and how much the winning flank can influence the fight. The Danish right wing tends to get a little bit congested, whilst the Swedish right-hand flank, wing, is more straightforward. If the Swedes are attacking and get their momentum right, they can manage to smash through the infantry line, but the Danish artillery can disrupt the advance and the much stronger second line becomes an important feature. This compared with the Swedish weak second line, being smaller and consisting of predominantly mounted units as shown before, and the disadvantage of fighting uphill. This allowed the Danes to withdraw short distances, putting the Swedish infantry temporarily out of hand-to-hand combat, where they are stronger, and into the firefight where the Danes are superior. This can be mitigated to some effect by having the Swedish king supporting the center, with rerolls to action tests, etc., making the charging easier, rather than supporting the right flank as he did in the real battle. We used rules to see whether the artillery had time to set up and start immediately with a 3+ base roll in the first round, then 2+ for the second, then the rest coming in automatically in the third round, or turn. This to symbolize the rush to line up and difficulty with moving the artillery. There is a link in the description to a blog post that details the units and how I have classified them. You might have a different interpretation and I might change them as I explore the battle further. As for the real Battle of Lund in 1676, I will summarize it in the way my father told me the story when I was in preschool, and I still remember his stories about this and many other battles more or less word for word. You just have to imagine his sweeping movements with his hand whilst he told the story. Thanks, Dad. I hope you understood what those stories meant to me. The two armies were in a race against Lund, and the fighting started with a cavalry clash on the Swedish right near the Windmill Hill. The Danish commander-in-chief, Arenstorff, was injured during the initial phase of the battle and had to leave the field, and his brother took charge of the army. The Swedes, attacking aggressively in the old Swedish manner, led by King Charles XI, paid dividends and the Danish cavalry broke. And the king started a long chase after the fleeing Danish cavalry, leaving the scene of the main battle. The Swedish center moved towards the Danes on the hill, whilst being pounded by the Danish artillery. The Danes started moving, and the stronger lines managed to push the Swedish center towards Lund. The Swedish left managed to push back the Danish cavalry, but the overall pressure seemed overwhelming, and everything was hanging in the balance. Now the king, finally, returned from his pursuit and instilled renewed strength into the Swedish force, whilst the Danes seemed to lose theirs. The fighting intensified and the Danes were pushed back and routed. This is where the battles in this era shows its ugly face. No longer the romanticism of linear warfare, gently manly behavior, lace and silk, fancy colored units, floppy hats, beautiful flags, standards, and shiny steel. Instead, soldiers being cut down from behind whilst they were running for their lives over the frozen fields. The killings were eventually stopped, stragglers taken prisoners, and the rest of the Danes got away. This project was mainly made using the fantastic range of 6mm miniatures from Bacchus' Wars of the Sun King range. It includes soldiers with a specific headgear of the Scanian or the Swedish troops called the Carpus. This was used alongside the normal hats of the era. For the Dutch sailors, I mainly used miniatures from the Microworld games, Witch Hunters and Farmers, to represent the badly equipped and organized sailors that was used as infantry by the Danes. The buildings used were from battle-scale wargame buildings, Bacchus 6mm, Total Battle miniatures, and Timecast. The trees were cheap tree armatures bought off eBay and delivered from China, with some PVA glue and sprinkled with snowflake. The mat was made using a plastic backdrop sheet that you would use to protect your floors whilst doing painting. I spread layers of acrylic paste mixed with sand and paint on top to shape the roads, creek, and elevations. Pieces of foam were then used under the mat to indicate elevation changes. As for the actual battle, there were over 9,000 dead on the fields north of Lund the following day. About 3,000 Swedes and 6,000 Danes. It was the bloodiest battle fought in Scandinavia ever. The dead were buried in mass graves once the temperature were favorable for digging in February, more than 2 months after the battle. It must have been a horrible sight with bodies piled up waiting for the right weather conditions. If Sweden would have lost the battle, Denmark would most certainly have won the war. The battle did not end the Scanian War that lasted for yet another 2 years, when the Danes evacuated from Landskrona back to Denmark. This monument that was erected in 1883 in Lund was about reconciliation and not to commemorate the Swedish victory. The text in Swedish translates to 1676, the 4th of December. Here fought and bled people of the same tribe. Memorial erected by reconciled descendants. There are a number of sources in Swedish that I have used for this project, but in English I can really recommend the following book. It's called Charles XI's War by Mikael Fredholm von Essen and covers the Scanian War. This is a brilliant book, even for those who may already have Swedish and Danish sources. The Danes would come back for another try to grab Scania during the Great Northern War, and the decisive battle then was the battle at Helsingborg in 1710. But that is, as they say, another history. I really hope you found this of some interest. If you want to engage further with questions or comments, please leave them here, or even better, contact me through the blog roller1.com. Finally, I would like to thank Adam Bengtsson and Pelle Åström for their help sourcing some up-to-date video from the beach at Rå and the monument in Lund. Also great thanks to Nick Dorrell for our discussion and interpretation of the rules for the battle, and Alexandra for making this video with me. Thank you.